practice in the Office of Innovation Partnerships. If Innovation Partnerships was previously known as Tech Transfer, so our responsibility at Michigan is the management and support of intellectual property across the university. So anything that's developed utilizing University of Michigan resources, time, energy, or effort, and that's clearly done in combination with the PIs and the creators. And that's a very important part of this topic. Gabe had asked and Victoria had asked me to kind of do a presentation that we do very frequently on open source and having people appreciate and kind of understand how that's managed inside the university. So that's the intention here, is to kind of work through that process. Hopefully we can do that. The agenda is just kind of, some of this is going to be background. For some folks, it's probably a little bit remedial. For other folks, might be new stuff. Just kind of talking a little bit about license types and understanding it. Some of the mechanics around that. How it relates with sponsored research, patenting, and related things. And then really, I think what's important is, how do we think about here at Michigan? And then some additional resources. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions at any point during this conversation. So please don't hesitate to ask or put them in the chat or wherever you want to try and put those messages. Open source has kind of got an interesting history in the sense that I somewhat laugh now when I see this Ballmer quote, because the company that is the prime owner of GitHub, clearly would have a slightly different point of view today. There's a lot of people who have different perspectives on these things. I think it's become more of a generalized accepted practice across most institutions, groups, companies, and trying to understand it. Doesn't mean that everybody is participating in a way that everybody feels great about, unfortunately, but certainly is more the standard practice is open ecosystems. I somewhat chuckle when I see this Richard Stallman quote, but Stallman really, if you've ever seen him speak, it's very interesting. I strongly encourage that. So it's kind of like a tent revival. He's very enthusiastic about it, but he certainly is in slightly different perspective on it, in the sense that it is really, as he says in the quote, it's a social movement, something that's beyond just the technical and legal aspects of it. And of course, a little quote from Trigill about rsync. So that people fully appreciate, open source is a passive conditional license that's applied to code. What does that mean? A conditional license means that if you take it, this means you take anything off of any Git repo or any other place that you're accessing code, the conditions of the license apply to you. You don't have to sign anything. There's no counter signatures. None of that actually transpires. The mere act, and this is the way it's legally reviewed, is by consuming it with a license posted on it, you're required to follow those conditions that are inside of that license. Those license conditions are generally allowing you a lot of flexibility with respect to modification, copying, redistributing it, doing all these things, and generally without cost. There's a big discussion, of course, always about free, in the sense of free as in freely available versus free as in without cost. Generally speaking, when we're talking about it in this context, it's free as in freely available. And of course, what we're really talking about here, and I think most people truly get this, but it's the source. It's basically the ability to get in, manipulate, and edit the foundational aspect of the code, not the compiled version, the publicly available underlying source code. So there's a couple of things to think about in this, in the sense that the key components that are discussed are, in terms of open source, are really, what do you get to do with that code? So if it's open and I'm freely giving you access to the source, what are those things that the copyright holder, the person who created it, or the contributors have provided access to what are the things you get to do with it. And they're explicit based on that license. And all those licenses are not the same, but the intent is clearly to put the code out in a public manner to basically allow collaboration and contribution from a variety of different folks. There's really two primary key players in the open source governance model, and it's the Open Source Initiative, OSI, and FSF, or the Free Software Foundation. These are very loose organizations. It's important to appreciate this. There is no governing body. It isn't like submitting something to UL or NIST or something like that. They are really very, very open and collaborative organizations. It's a loose confederation of people interested in the area, but they are not kind of an imprimatur or a checkoff. That's actually not how it works at all. They haven't really on the OSI side, which is generally the organization that approves open source licenses, if that even makes sense on some level, really have not approved a tremendous amount of licenses in the last 5 years. Most of the licenses exist. We'll talk a little bit about more of the specifics around that in a minute, but they are kind of the oversight side of it. The Free Software Foundation, which Stallman is way more involved with, is really what I would consider more the policy and public goods side of the equation. And I always mention Creative Commons in this because we run into this a fair bit with folks where it's like, oh, I'm going to put a Creative Commons license on my code. If you don't remember anything else from the presentation that we talk about today, that is really not the right way to go. An OSI license is what you're going to want to put on it. Creative Commons is intended for content. And if you really dig into their site, they're really explicit about this. They will point you back to the GPL license and say, don't use a Creative Commons license on code, use a open software initiative license on code. So they're pretty explicit about it. There are a variety of different types of licenses. OSI has over 70 different licenses. Most people are very familiar with the most common ones, the BSD, MIT, GNU GPL, the LGPL, AGPL, those licenses, the MIT license. But there are 70 of them, and they're all over the place, and they all do different things. Another thing that I would hope people would remember out of this conversation is you really don't need to invent a new license. There's very little reason to do that. There's a lot of friction that comes with that. The licenses that exist, and there's about what we would generally consider the big 6 or 7, are going to cover 99.9% of any circumstance that you actually need to operate under. Doesn't mean you can't use any of these other licenses, just means they're going to come with a certain amount of friction with them because they're very unfamiliar to most people. Some people like to get cute. There's one called the free beer license. We're big advocates of kind of sticking with the standards and using ones that people are familiar with, because ultimately a lot of people are going to have to check off as somebody in an office of general counsel or other legal group. There's really 3 things that we think about when we're talking about open source licenses, and they're really these characteristics about what are the things you can do under that license, what are the things you can't do, and then explicitly what are the things you absolutely must do as a result of that. And again, when we think about kind of the big 6, we think about on the highly permissive licenses, the Apache licenses, the BSD license, and the MIT license. And then on the other end of it, the strong copyleft or highly restrictive licenses, the GPL and AGPL, and kind of in the middle is, a more moderated one, the LGPL, because it specifically applies narrowly to a library. It's always interesting anyway, the language that's used to describe these, because the reality is they're somewhat counterintuitive to the way the actual licenses work, especially the strong copyleft license or the restrictive license. The GPL and AGPL licenses are restrictive in the sense that if you combine with those particular licenses, you must, on a forward basis, release under the same terms. So if you bring component A, B, C, and D together, and one of those, let's call it C, has a GPL or an AGPL license on it, everything in that combined work has to be released under that. Different than the Apache, BSD, MIT licenses, which are much more permissive and allow you to do pretty much within some basic limitations on the must side of it, do whatever you would like to do with those particular pieces of code. So kind of go into those general buckets when we say the cans, can'ts, and musts. This is really what you're looking at on the permissive side. You can use these things commercially, which is the big reasons they tend to be very attractive to companies. So you can modify these things, you can redistribute it, you can sublicense it, you can use it for your own. And in several places, if there are patent claims governing that actual expression in the code, you get a patent grant with it. That's a big deal for somebody who's patenting a method patent underneath one of these particular forms of code. And then on the must side of it, and this is the thing that's persistent in all open source licenses, it's an attribution-based exchange. The musts are always including the copyright notice, which is the original notice that allows you to have the family tree and understand kind of where the code came from. That's the big benefit, generally speaking, in broadly available public projects is where did this originate, who was involved with it, and it helps with reputation development. And then there's kind of the cannot things in the middle. And as you might imagine, most of these are around the what I would call the traditional legal side. It has to do with warranty and indemnification. So basically, these things are without warranty. And you can't sue anybody for any reason when you use them. You know, they're basically as is types of products. And that's the way they would like to proceed and kind of in the long-standing tradition with it. If you think about the permissive licenses, a couple of things here, just the yellow highlighted portions. The MIT license is attractive to a lot of people for a lot of good reasons. And the main reason is it's basically, 3 paragraphs if you consider the yellow highlighted sentence a paragraph. They're very simple, easy to read, generally well understood. But the highlighted portion is the key part. The above copyright notice and this permission notice shall be included in all copies or substantial portions of software. And that's that attribution thing. It's basically being able to go back and say, where did this thing come from? Who was involved with it? The Apache license goes a little bit further. You must give any other recipients of the work a copy of this license. They're really explicit. Basically, downstream, you have to give a copy with that portion of it. And you have to do that in source form, which is also inside of that. You also have to include things like the notice file so people understand what particularly has changed and make that available to folks. The other interesting part, and we get this a lot more frequently, is kind of, well, what about contributions? How are contributions handled? And does somebody have to do a contributor license agreement, and do we have to manage that? CLA, some people are familiar with this. It's basically if somebody's participating in your project, do you have to get them to assign something to say they're giving it to you? In the Apache license, they're really good about it. It's basically like, listen, if you contribute to this, you're contributing it to it under the same terms as the actual license it's under right now. It's really, really clear. It's like this thing is going to be available under permissive license and all the terms that Apache applies to it. And we can talk about that if somebody really wants to get into it offline, but CLAs are really not something that traditionally is done anymore. So a lot of questions we get into with people are like, well, how do you actually comply to these things? It's, as you might imagine, when you get ready to distribute your source, you have to include these things. So when they say include the copyright notice, include the license, include the notice file and indicate the changes, literally those are the files, copyright.txt, license.txt, notice.txt. There's nobody out there enforcing this. This is something I always like to tell people. It's about whether you're actually operating in what I would consider good form with the community and the standard, or if you are not. You'll see people who go, well, I distributed the copyright notice, and then on the bottom of it, I put all the other stuff. Well, the challenge with that, of course, is the reason they say inside the licenses that you have to have these separate things is so that people can find those different things, right? I want to know what the original license was like. I want to know who the original copyright holders are. I want to know exactly what the changes are that you made. Just kind of a common courtesy, if you will, when you're trying to manage these projects. And then there's really the copyleft licenses or the highly restrictive licenses, and these are all the PL licenses, so LGPL, GPL, and AGPL. Everybody can read this as well as I can. The biggest difference with the licenses in the PL group is that they have high inheritance. People who don't like them will say they're highly viral in the sense that basically they require you to incorporate these terms for anything that combines with this. That's a religious argument. There's no right answer. This is what the license is. And again, if you're going to use it, understand it. The key difference between these is the LGPL is applying solely to a license. So you may have some component that you're distributing and you just want this uh, tiny piece to be subject to that, not the entire project. And that's a way to get through that. GPL was originally done to make it super high inheritance and make sure that the project stayed open, especially downstream. And of course, somebody went and put the application up on a SaaS application, hosted it, said, hey, you didn't say I couldn't host it. And they closed it, made it commercial. And that did not make a number of people happy. And that's when they came up with what's called the Affero GPL or the AGPL license, which has a very explicit restriction that says you cannot do that. So you cannot host it and say you're no longer required to release the source. And that's kind of what you see here. Again, some highlights from the license, not everything here. But changing the license isn't allowed. You can't kind of do your own thing. Very different on the permissive licenses, the MIT, BSD, and Apache. You can change that. You can license it under anything you want as long as you maintain those copyright and attribution notices. And then that second part under C is really what we're talking about as far as this inheritance thing. You must license the entire work as a whole under this license. And therefore, that's that inheritance piece. So the question we get a lot is really kind of what happens when you start mixing these things together. So, what happens when you bring different versions together? What takes precedence and how does that work? Because in the copyleft license, as it says in the GPL thing, requires everything downstream to follow the same pattern. So that's the question we ask ourselves. This is a bit of a exercise in helping people understand it. It's really kind of thinking about different components being brought together. So combining those works, things on the left, what happens with the derivatives or a modified work? And then what if I have a separate component that I want to manage kind of independent of things? How do all those things come together? We'll talk about that. So if you integrate a permissive component, so this orange block or puzzle piece, if you will, with the three other yellow pieces, and you combine it and then you distribute it, you can license that under any terms you basically want in a permissive arrangement, because the permissive license says, hey, you can do whatever you want, up to and including closing it and making it a proprietary piece of software. So that is absolutely allowed when you combine a component into your final product. You can make it private. So the other question becomes, what happens if I take that piece and I just make a derivative of it? So it's version 1.x of it. How can I license that? Again, you can license that any way you want, up to including a proprietary piece of software. So it doesn't have to be a combination. It can be just modification of that original piece of permissive software. Then the question kind of comes out is, what if I combine one of these more restrictive licenses, LGPL in particular in this example, a weak copyleft component with a bunch of proprietary components I have? And this is really the reason LGPL was even written in the first place. If you have a combined work and there's some separation on that LGPL component, you can take the combined work and license that under a proprietary license, and then only the LGPL component is subject to the LGPL terms. So there's this concept called significant separation. The best way I can really describe that is when you have that repo, you can look at it, put a circle around it, say that's that component, and it is separated, so it's not combined. Or you're providing instructions how to combine it after the fact. So get to come to the same thing. You start with a weak copyleft component. You create a derivative modification, again, 1.3, 1.4, whatever of it. It remains under those terms. You can't go backwards with an LGPL component. If that's the only thing you did was make a modification of that particular component, it goes under the same license. And then finally, the GPL and AGPL licenses, I combine that with other things, even if it's a permissive license, what happens? This is the high inheritance effect. You have one component, and upon distribution, if you combine those together, those things are required to be released under that same term. So if you have a GPL component in the mix, everything that you distribute after that has to be GPL. If you have an AGPL component in the mix, everything you distribute after the fact has to follow it. And that is the high inheritance thing. So something to be very thoughtful of if you have a strong opinion about a more permissive license, such as the MIT BSD or Apache licenses. If you start using the GPL components, you got to be really thinking about what that means. Same thing as the derivative work. If you take this original strong copyleft component, you make 1.x version of it, same license. The compliance side of this is the key part of it, and very, very important couple of points here. Those notice files, the copyright.txt and the license files, those are the things they're telling you must do. And then you really also have to either redistribute or you have to be able to point access to the source that you receive. So you got to, again, going back to that family heritage thing, you got to be able to find this thing. So people have to be able to get back to the original one. And the key point here is basically equivalent access. You can't do anything that makes it difficult to get a hold of these things in a copyleft setting. And that's really the key spirit of these licenses is open when you got it, open when you made modifications, and open as you distribute downstream. So if you end up with a copyleft component in your build, and you're like, I don't really want to release everything in a copyleft license. I don't want to put it in under a GPL or an AGPL license. What can I do? Well, it's really relatively simple. You can remove it. So you can say, listen, component A, B, and C are the ones I'm distributing, but you also need D, but you got to go get it. That's fine. You can take A, B, and C and license it however you want. You can rewrite it. So you can look at it. That's just to the nature of open source. I can look at the way it works. I can rewrite it as an original work, and I can I can combine it, and I can do whatever I want as far as I'm concerned with licensing it from that. You can relicense it. So typical dual licensing thing, you can say, I want to license it under commercial terms or whatever terms you'd like. And the original creator has the right to do that. They own it and control it. They can decide that they want to relicense it to you in a specific way. And then, of course, you could just release a copyleft, which is the entire spirit of the thing, what they're trying to get you to do. We get this question a lot from people. I'm pursuing potential patenting of a project or a system or a method or a combination of things. How's that play into open source? And the answer, quite honestly, is really the one at the bottom. If you're releasing stuff open source, you don't patent it. Those things are just mutually explicit activities or mutually exclusive activities, and they're not things that should be combined. There's lots and lots of reasons that people will pursue more formal IP rights against things. It's not a bad thing. This isn't a good or bad argument. It's just about a decision relative to how you want to manage the project. But if you're going to open source release stuff, there really shouldn't be a patent conversation going on with it. That's just kind of our mutually exclusive activities. Many of the open source licenses have very explicit grants. And this is important if you're working with somebody on a project. It's like, hey, I have a patent application for this and we're trying to manage it accordingly. Well, if you release it under certain versions of these open source licenses, you're actually giving the public a grant to your patent, and they basically say you could use it. At that point, the patent really is unenforceable. You can't do anything with it. So it's really important to think about it in the event that there are patents on a project you might be participating in. They said this at the outset, but it is really important to remember is practically speaking, these licenses that are listed here are going to manage the overwhelming majority of projects you're ever going to operate under, the Apache BSD and MIT on the permissive side, then of course the PL licenses. And the main reason is these things are just well known. People are very, very, very comfortable with what they say, how they work, and what it means. They're very clear. They're exceptionally well supported. deep familiarity in the community with respect to how these things operate. So if you want to use something else, it's not to say that's a never, it's to say be very thoughtful about that. We're always happy to work with people and help them understand what that choice means and why. But generally speaking, this is going to cover you in most cases. When I talked to Gabe and Victoria about this originally, part of it is trying to help people also appreciate and understand policy inside the university, some licensing models around that, how these things work. It's important to appreciate how this works. Software developed at the university as a result of a project that you're on, that you're paid to do, that you have a grant on, that is supported by your department, et cetera, et cetera. So that software is owned by the University of Michigan. That's what the policy says. It's not really a debate kind of thing. That is the policy that governs it. It's part of the SPG that's listed here. It's part of the tech policy transfer, and it's also part of a regent's bylaw. The purpose of our office and the purpose of helping people manage their projects is not to prevent them from releasing it open source. It's to help them make good decisions about how they're going to manage the project. But it is important to appreciate kind of the sequence of activity, if you will, and as to how those things work. So hopefully everybody appreciates that's the letter of the law. The spirit of the law is Michigan has a very long tradition of supporting open source, been doing it for a long, long time. And the only reason you would be even given a slight pause on it is to say, let's think about this. Is this the right thing to do with this project? Yes or no? Why or why not? Are there other things we want to consider? That's really the process of how it works. If people are very adamant that they want to release it open source, we're going to be very, very amenable to trying to help make that happen. There's some things that have come up recently with respect to open science and open data initiatives. If you read that policy from NSF and NIH, they're like, well, now everything's got to be open. The University of Michigan has spent a tremendous amount of time through what's called the RDSI, or the Research Data Science Initiative, to work on that policy. There's a tremendous amount of resource on that. The Open Science Initiative, in summary, does not mean that all the code that's delivered with it has to be made open. That's actually not how it works. There's kind of a sequence of activities that go here. The overarching law that governs things that are developed under federal grants in particular is a law called Bayh-Dole. It's been in existence since 1980. It's a law versus a policy recommendation. And the law is that the universities own and are obligated to report inventions, including software, under those federal grants. And that preempts any of these subsequent things. Again, we're trying to support those initiatives. We are pro open data and open science. It's about managing through that sequence and making intelligent decisions that work for everybody's interests. It's kind of a best practices type of thing, and engaging with the teams to understand what to do. It's not a policing activity. We have this conversation a lot with people. We're not out trying to find these projects. We're out trying to help facilitate making good decisions about those projects. There's a lot of, unfortunately, good, bad, or indifferent, there's a lot of litigation around open source lately. Anybody who's been following the most recent one is the WordPress situation, where there's now a big fight between the creators of WordPress and then the WordPress hosting group. There's been a long standing fight going on with different companies like Elastic and Amazon and a few others that are having problems with folks taking these projects and really negatively impacting the project because they're making commercial versions of it that really hurt the core project. Again, those are conversations I'm happy to talk to people about offline. The point being, it's about management and being thoughtful about what you're trying to do with the project. Super summary is use a known license. Don't create a new license. There's no reason to do that. Think about the project goals. What are we trying to do? Think about the contributors. Is everybody on board with that? Think about the contents that you have. Are there any other open source components that are going to drive what you have to do? And then kind of think about what we're trying to do. Are we trying to get contribution, distribution? Do you want freedom in the true sense of access? Like, I just want that to be the case. I want to develop some commercial aspect of it. Those are all things that are worthy of a little bit of time and consideration to think about when it comes to open source and how we manage that. At the end of the day, my advice is pretty basic. It's keep it simple. This can become highly convoluted and sometimes frustrating. Think about what the best outcome is, and then let's apply the right thinking or the right direction around what that is to support the goals and objectives of the project. I've been in the software business now longer than I care to admit, going on 40 years. And I've been involved with open source the entire time. I kind of just tell people it's what you think you know is probably more dangerous than what you actually know. So it can be a little tricky. The only message here is there's lots of resources here at Michigan that can help you through these discussions and processes, and we're happy to help out. And that really is our team here in Innovation Partnership. So it's like, don't hesitate to ask for help. We can walk through the different options and get to a really good decision that's going to help you, your project, and frankly, keep people on the right side of things. That's a lot. I appreciate that's a lot in a short period of time with respect to compliance and policies and all these other things. It is complicated. There's a big updated release coming out here the end of this month. There's a project called Moss, which I know Gabe's been waiting to see for a little bit here. We're a little bit behind, but big initiative to kind of reintroduce a number of things that we've done for a long, long time, but they're really around that open source consulting and reviewing your project and working with you, license compliance, helping you develop community engagement, working with different teams on grant support. There's a couple of great grants out now that are just phenomenal. One is called the NSF POSE grant, which is the project for open source ecosystems. It's basically, it's one of my favorite grants going right now, honestly, because it addresses a big need. It is around building community around projects. It's not about hands to keyboard and coding. It's all the other stuff that tends to be um, under-resourced in our experience. You know, people who are doing documentation, people are doing program management, people are doing marketing and awareness building and things of that nature. Really cool grant to help projects develop a viable community around them. And then the Sloan Foundation in particular doing a couple of really super cool grants around supporting open source projects and open science, some good stuff there. And NASA in particular is one of my favorite examples. They continue to probably run the largest open source ecosystem in the federal government right now, really, really well structured. And they continue to do a lot of great education and related activity that I think is always interesting. So very, very good group of people to look at. And I think kind of setting the bar as to how these things should be done. We do a lot of education like this presentation, been done a lot. We bring speakers on campus. We've had Heather Meeker speak several times. Trying to get her here next year as well. And just a lot of promotion and awareness building around your project. Having an open source project is great. Having people know it's there, using it, contributing, even more important, something that we've been spending a lot of time on. You'll hear more about the Moss project shortly. Some resources to get lots of people. Yes, happy to give you these slides, but I would tell you if you're looking for kind of the things that I think are really good, if you're not doing this as a daily job and you're just interested in it, these are a couple of great resources to look at. TLDR is a project that I participated in for a long, long time. It's a really good licensing site that kind of talks about all the different open source licenses. There's another site there called Choose a License, which is a good one if you're trying to walk through which one you want to use and why. That email is going to go right to my team, and we're more than happy to help you with that. And then this, if you really want to geek out and get into it, Heather Meeker's written a couple of really great books and has a great website that I encourage people to look at. But that book is, as I always like to say, she wrote the book on it. If you read that book, you'll see some stuff that looks really familiar because it's really the way it's presented. Gabe, hopefully I got done in enough time to let you get to the rest of your agenda, but happy to answer questions or talk about anything that people would like to talk about.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me pause the recording.